And joining us now in our studio in Washington is John Nixon. He served as a senior analyst with the CIA from 1998 to 2011, regularly briefing top U.S. government officials. In a new book, Debriefing the President, The Interrogation of Saddam Hussein, he reveals surprising details about his interrogation of the former Iraqi leader. John, thanks a lot for coming into the studio.
Thank you for having me.
So, Saddam Hussein captured in December 2003. Shortly afterwards, you were sent in to question him, to interrogate him. Take us through that first meeting and what that was like.
Sure, it was the night he was captured, and he was brought down from Tikrit to a place right by the airport in Baghdad. And I was brought out to identify him and to ask him some questions. And I was led down a hallway, and the door opened, and I remember thinking, I couldn't believe it was him, number one. I was sort of pinching myself because I couldn't believe I was here at this moment in history. And he just sort of, one of the things that struck me most about him that night was just how calm and collected he was. He didn't look like a man who had been basically captured and had his world turned upside down and was now a prisoner. He almost acted as though he came here every Saturday night and that we were his guests. Did you know straight off that it was him? I was looking for certain physical characteristics, scars, tribal tattoos, but I have to tell you, the minute I laid eyes on him, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I knew it was him. He had also been shaved, so he didn't have the long beard anymore. But again, he was sitting 2 feet away, and there was just not a doubt in my mind.
And when you started talking to him, when you told him you were there to question him, what was his response? What kind of demeanor did he have?
His demeanor was that of kind of confrontational. He just sort of looked at me, and I asked my first question, and I said to him, "When was the last time you saw your sons alive?" And he just sort of listened to the translation, and then he just sort of went, he had this mean laugh, and then he just said, "Why don't you tell me who you are? Who are you guys? Give me your names," like as though demanding that we report to him. And at that point, somebody said, "No, you're here to answer our questions, not the other way around." And so we went on.
Right, because you described him variously as charismatic, rude, arrogant, and scary. That's quite a package there.
Yeah, well, the thing is, once we started talking to him on a daily basis,
right.
And we got to know each other. Initially, he could be very warm, charming, self-deprecating in his humor, and I remember thinking, God, this guy, we really got this guy wrong. But then over time,
who was in the room when you were talking to him?
Oh, it was myself. It was a polygrapher who served as a facilitator, sort of somebody who got conversation going, and then a translator, and Saddam.
Was he scared? Did he show any fear at all?
No, no. Actually, one of the things about Saddam is even when we would hear mortars going off, he wouldn't flinch. If he really didn't. And when he was executed, he behaved exactly the way I thought he would, which was basically to not show any fear.
And was he cooperative? Did he answer your questions? Did you have to use any kind of coercion?
No, actually, the head of my team originally planned to use enhanced interrogation techniques, and fortunately that was stopped by Washington. He was very cooperative when he wanted to be.
He was a prisoner of war, right?
Yeah, he was given Geneva Convention protections, yes.
Right, so you couldn't use those techniques against him. You would be violating the Geneva Convention.
Yes, yes.
Right. Okay, now the ostensible reason the United States went to war was because of weapons of mass destruction, which the U.S. believed Saddam Hussein allegedly had. We know now that that was not the case.
Right.
When you asked him about that, what did he say?
He said, "You found Saddam Hussein. You found a traitor to turn in Saddam Hussein. Why don't you find another traitor to tell you where this WMD is?"
You established some kind of rapport with him
yes.
At that point. Was he being forthright with you?
Yes, I believe so. One of the difficulties in talking to Saddam Hussein, though, was that even when he was telling you the truth, he was so secretive and so suspicious that you kind of walked away thinking, this man's lying to me. There's something not right about this. And a lot of times I would go back and I would check the record, and then I'd check on a few other things, and then I realized, no, actually he is telling the truth.
The WMD thing is very interesting because that was the reason for war. You also had some information that came from a very unlikely source, South Africa.
Yes.
The South Africans told you that they had established that he did not have WMD. How did the South Africans get involved in this?
Well, apparently, I was contacted by somebody recently who's a journalist in South Africa, and he had told me that the South African government, who had their own nuclear program before the time of democracy in South Africa, was moving towards a nuclear weapon, and they had a lot of interaction with the Iraqi scientific community. And from those interactions, by 2002, they basically told the Mbeki administration that they believed that Iraq didn't have any WMD, and they didn't have any WMD programs. And apparently, President Mbeki conveyed that to Prime Minister Tony Blair. Blair just kind of blew off that information, and it damaged South African and British relations. And then he actually was in the White House. He came to the United States, was in the White House, and he told President Bush and Vice President Cheney. And yet that information was never conveyed to us at CIA, not to my knowledge.
You know, Saddam was portrayed to the world as a man who was a threat, not just to the United States, but to the world as well. But you say different after talking to him. You say that the United States had misread him, that he saw himself and the United States as natural allies in a fight against extremism.
Yeah. You know, I asked him, we were talking about 9/11, and I said to him, what was your reaction to 9/11? What were your thoughts on that? And he said, I was relieved. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I was relieved that finally the United States would now see that the enemies, the people that knocked down their buildings, were the same enemies that I was dealing with here in Iraq and in this region, and that, you know, we both had the same enemies. This would make the United States come to its senses and realize that Iraq could be a valuable ally in this fight.
Among many surprising things I found in your book was one where you talk about how he was seen in Iraq itself. I mean, he's Sunni. Yeah. The Sunnis are in the minority in Iraq. He's a Sunni leader, but he saw his threat not coming from the majority, the main threat to him, not coming from the majority Shias, but from Sunni extremism.
Yes.
And in that respect, he was incredibly prescient, wasn't he?
Absolutely. One of the shortcomings, I think, of our analysis at CIA is that we thought of the Sunni community as sort of monolithic with Saddam at the top. But really, he was more concerned about the Sunni extremist threat, more concerned about that than about the United States, about Iran, or about what the Shia or the Kurdish communities could do to him.
Because, you know, listening to some of what he said, which you quote in the book, he said, I foresee Iraq is going to be a playground for terrorism.
Yes.
It's exactly what it became.
Absolutely.
Right. He also said during one... Go ahead.
He knew his country so much better than we did. And he was not a sophisticated man when it came to understanding international relations, but he knew Iraq and he knew Iraqis. And, you know, it's a tragedy that all of this happened.
He also knew what was going to happen to the United States, because as you say in the book, he told you, you're going to fail. You're going to find it is not so easy to govern Iraq.
Yes. And, you know, something, he was absolutely right. And 13 years later, I have to tell you that I have sort of a grudging respect for him, because we've seen how difficult governing Iraq is. And he was somebody, I don't approve of his methods, but he is somebody who was able to govern effectively that country.
And in the run-up to war, in the build-up, you say he was not completely in charge of Iraq. He'd left it to his underlings at that point.
Well, yeah, near the end, I mean, he was still very much president of Iraq, right. And there were still certain things that he was concerned with, but for the most part, he had become disengaged from the day-to-day running of the country, and had other pursuits in mind that he was much more interested in, like writing, of all things.
And when he was actually being held by the United States, he asked for writing materials.
Oh, yeah. He would say to me repeatedly, he'd say, I am a writer, and I need to be able to write my thoughts down. And he felt very, very put upon that he was not allowed to do this. The military did not give him writing materials because they were afraid that he would harm himself, or they didn't want to take that chance. When
you were talking to him, and you interrogated him several times, what went through your mind when you looked at this man and thought, how did we get this so wrong?
You know, that's a great question. You know, at first, I didn't think we were wrong, but over time, I began to sort of come around to the conclusion that, you know, there were things that were missing, and there were things that we never fully understood. One of the problems is that our sources of information had dried up, and we were looking. In the larger arc of Saddam's career, we were correct, but the granularity was missing. And we were thinking of Saddam the way he was in the 1980s. And Saddam was a very different ruler in 2002 and 2003. And, you know, he was an older man, and he just had there were different priorities. And I think our analysis just never caught up with reality.
You had been working on this, shall I call it, account for a long time, the Iraq desk.
Yeah.
and at some point you were called to the White House to brief the president.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Well, it was about 5 years later. It was regarding, when I came back in 2004, there was really no interest, nobody had any interest in what the debriefings had produced, largely because the debriefings had produced the message that there was no WMD in Iraq. And we were met with sort of a...
And that was not the message the president wanted to hear.
No, and we were met with a sort of sense of resignation. And sort of like, no one wants to hear bad news, so therefore we're not interested.
Let me ask you this. If the director of the CIA at that time, George Tenet, if he had walked into the Oval Office and spoke to the other George, the president, and said, Mr. President, we have done our work, we've done an investigation, we've established that Saddam Hussein has no weapons of mass destruction, we have no doubt about that, would that have stopped the war?
No, I don't believe so. To be quite honest with you, I think WMD is almost irrelevant to this, because I believe that there were two very, very powerful forces at play here. One was the vice president and the other one was the president. The president went to war in Iraq, and from day one, the Bush administration wanted to do something about Saddam Hussein. They just didn't know how they were going to do it. After 9/11, basically Saddam's fate was sealed on that day. The president wanted to get rid of him because he felt that Saddam had tried to kill his father. The neocons surrounding Vice President Dick Cheney wanted to do this because after 9/11, they felt that all of these dictatorships in the region had to go, and that they were going to start with Iraq, and then they would move on from there. And unfortunately, but fortunately, their plans didn't work out.
2 points there. One is, did the president genuinely believe that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11?
That's a good question. I think initially his administration very much did. And in fact, when we came and briefed the vice president on this in 2008, they were still asking us questions about what are his ties to 9/11, what are his ties to terrorism, and still sort of looking for answers that had been answered long, long ago.
And the other intriguing question about why President Bush went to war, and that is, and you talk about this in the book, about the fact that Saddam Hussein had allegedly threatened to harm his father, to kill his father.
Yeah. I think that I always tell people, don't ever underestimate that as the reason for why we really went to war. You know, and the irony here is that the so-called assassination attempt in 1993 against George H.W. Bush has never been fully proven. And, but, you know, George W. Bush, as I said, came into office feeling that this was unfinished business.
Well, if it's unfinished business, was this a family feud then?
Yeah.
I mean, he took a country to war, which ended with, you know, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, 4,000 US deaths among the military, thousands more wounded, a country destroyed.
Exactly. And now he's painting portraits.
Right, and this was because he thought that Saddam Hussein wanted to kill his father. Yeah,
and I know it sounds trite, but I think that it's accurate, and I think that George W. Bush has. When I talked to President Bush in the Oval Office, he asked me what kind of man Saddam was, and I told him, and he said something. He said to me, he said, "Well, he's going to have a lot to answer for in the next life," and I wanted to say to him, you know, and so will you, you know, because. There is nothing good that has come from this war. I wish that weren't the case. I feel terrible for the thousands and thousands of Iraqis who have died, the thousands of U.S. personnel who have died, and just the terrible waste. But nothing good has come from this conflict.
Well, there are many who say that it changed the course of history. When you were talking to President Bush in the Oval Office, did he show that he was informed, or was he intimidating?
A little bit. I mean, he was actually, I think, well informed. I'm not sure he understood the information in terms of what it meant, but he was a well-informed president, and he could cite reports that we were talking about, and he knew what was going on. It's just that I think he had trouble understanding it.
Because there are other parts of the book where you're not very complimentary to the president. You describe one incident where he was being briefed at the beginning of his presidency by someone about Islam.
Yes.
And this briefer told the president, well, there are two branches of Islam. There's the Sunni branch, there's the Shia branch. And his response was, but I thought they were all Muslims.
Yeah, and that did take place.
And he actually said that.
Yeah.
On another occasion, while the recount, the famous recount, was taking place in Florida.
Yeah.
He was not yet president. He was sitting it out in Florida, waiting for this recount to finish. He was being debriefed, at least briefed by the CIA,
Yes.
by intelligence officials at that time on what was going on.
Yeah.
And he turned around at one point and said, I can't wait to be president because then you guys would give me the real stuff.
Yeah.
Did he actually believe that he was getting, what, intelligence light
Yes.
at this point?
Yes, and in fact, that was brought back to CIA headquarters, and we realized that we were going to have a lot of work on our hands to sort of inform him on the uses and misuses of intelligence. And it's unfortunate that he didn't have a better grasp of this because right with 9/11 and then with Iraq, you really needed to have somebody who understood intelligence and what it can do for you. I don't think that George Bush ever had a good understanding of how to use intelligence, nor how to use effectively military force. And I think that his subsequent actions as commander-in-chief proved that point exceedingly well.
What about the people around him? Vice President Dick Cheney, for example.
Yeah. Dick Cheney was a very interesting person. He was much more savvy, much more...
You call him the voice of reason.
Yeah, he was much more skilled, much easier to deal with. I wouldn't say that necessarily. He was somebody who, it was very hard to figure out where he was going with his questions or why he wanted to know something. He played his cards very close to the vest, and he was a much more skilled Washington player.
Right, when you sat in the Oval Office talking to the president, he was there?
Yes, yes.
And did he question you as well?
Oh, yeah, of course, of course. And I also did a separate briefing with Vice President Cheney, just on the Saddam debriefings. To answer an earlier question, you said why we went down there. In 2008, 60 Minutes, an American TV show, did an interview with the FBI debriefer. And subsequently, the FBI debriefer had made all of these claims that really were not true. And it led the White House to say, go back to CIA and say, well, why didn't you tell me he was going to restart? Why didn't you tell us he was going to restart his weapons program? And we said, well, we didn't tell you that because he never said that. And so that required us to do a paper and also do a briefing with the president and with the vice president on what exactly was said between the U.S. government and Saddam.
And that's interesting because when you talked to Saddam Hussein, what did he say about his inability to convey the fact that I don't have WMD?
Well, the thing is, that one of the questions I always get is, why didn't he just show us that he didn't have them? And I put that question to him, and he said, but I did. I've been telling you for years that I don't have them. I think one of the really important things, and I don't think enough people focus on this enough. The UNSCOM, the weapons inspectors who went in there to uncover the weapons, there was a huge intelligence presence as part of UNSCOM, and Saddam understood that, knew that, and I think that's one of the reasons why he distrusted the process, because I think he saw it not as trying to verify his weapons cache, but trying to verify regime vulnerabilities and use that to overthrow him.
I've got to ask you about the one other big play in this, and that was Donald Rumsfeld, because we saw him, and we still see him as the hawk, the gung-ho, let's go to war guy. He wasn't that.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think if anything, he was less hawkish than, say, Vice President Cheney. One of the problems, though, that I have with people like Cheney, Bush, Rumsfeld, Tenet, Tony Blair, Condoleezza Rice, is that in their memoirs are so self-serving, and they all make these claims, and they use this. They're still using this information and these justifications that just don't stand up anymore. And for me, writing this book, it was so important for me to get this out because I can tell you that everything in this book is true, and I don't have an agenda, unlike some others.
In all the conversations you had, in all the questions you put to Saddam Hussein, what was your overall goal? What did you want to get out of him?
I wanted to get a better understanding of who he was, and certainly I wanted to get to the heart of the questions that. Well, the heart of the question that Washington had, which was get him to tell you where the WMD is, and I felt that we did that successfully, even though it's not what they wanted to hear. I also wanted to get at some of the questions concerning how he ruled his country, and certainly the issue of human rights abuse, and get his take on that. And you come away with it again, realizing that his methods were brutal. But there were a lot of things that he did that, you understand it a little bit better, as opposed to just condemning it and saying that he shouldn't have done this.
You're one of the few people in the world, probably, who's shook hands with Saddam Hussein and with President Bush. But
Right.
yet you say you would rather spend time with Saddam than with Bush.
Yes. I found George W. Bush to be an arrogant, imperious, unreflective man. And I thought that was, there were so many qualities to him that I found really kind of revolting a little bit. And
Right.
also, I had voted for him twice. The first time enthusiastically, the second time not so enthusiastically. And I remember after my second session in the Oval Office, I wanted to say, where do I go to get my votes back?
Yet you say that both these guys are very similar.
Yeah, that's one of the strangest things. They both got to the top of their political careers, but yet they both had very little understanding of the outside world. Both had almost no understanding of the military and what military force can do. Both very imperious and almost king-like in their demeanors.
You say towards the end of the book, you say the ouster of Saddam Hussein from power proved to be a calamity for Iraq. It is now a failed state, pure and simple. In fact, in the opening lines of your book, you say the rise of Islamic extremism in Iraq, chiefly under the rubric of ISIS, is a catastrophe that the United States needn't have faced had it been willing to live with an aging and disengaged Saddam Hussein.
Yes, I believe that. And you know something? There were many things that Saddam was not paying attention to at the end, but he always kept his eye on extremism because he knew that if that was unleashed, that could rot his regime from within. And I think to this day, if he were still alive and ruling, he would have had his foot very firmly on the throat of any extremists.
So it is all for naught then?
I believe so, yes.
How does that make you feel?
Terrible. Every day, myself and many of the analysts that worked on this, we talk about it, and we all feel like we did the road to hell was paved with the best of intentions. And I personally don't look at politics and politicians the same way that I once did.
And how do you think it made the millions of Iraqis feel?
Probably wishing for the days of Saddam Hussein to be back.
I want to ask you a question about something that's taking place right now. We have a new president, of course,
Sure.
President Trump. He's been having something of a running battle with the CIA.
Yeah.
They've been tossing words at each other. He's accused the CIA of leaking information, classified information, and likened the CIA to Nazis. Can this relationship recover? I mean, does the president need the CIA more than the CIA needs the president?
No, they both need each other.
Yeah.
And certainly words like that are not very helpful. And it's exacerbated by the media, I think, who sometimes likes to play up these divisions. But certainly the CIA and the president need each other, because if there is a bit of daylight between these two, or if you have a president that disregards its intelligence community, our enemies will fish in those troubled waters, and they will exacerbate those divisions, and then they'll succeed, and we won't.